Nice to meet you all. My name is Steve Monnery. I'm the head of casework services at the National Autistic Society. Just to give you an idea of what that actually means, I look after a number of our support services, our advice and information service. So there's the Autism Helpline, which provides general information advice across the UK on what is autism, behaviour strategies, self-injurious challenging behaviour, housing, all sorts of types of issues. Not that we know everything ourselves, but often we're just signposting people onto services that will be able to support them. I also look after our Education Rights Service, which is how I actually got involved with the National Autistic Society. And the Education Rights Service is there for parents who want to know a bit more about rights and entitlements in the school setting, but also when things go wrong, to actually try to provide them with some place to come and explore their thoughts, their feelings, and the ways forward. It does include tribunal support, but obviously wherever possible we try to get parents to actually work with their schools, with their local authorities to reach a mutually agreeable solution. Other services include welfare rights, so information and advice on benefits and financial matters, community care, so about getting support needs met both for the individual with autism themselves and their families and carers. Transitions, a brand new thing. Obviously transitions is pretty major in the life of people with autism, so we're really working on that, and working on it specifically in terms of resources, information resources about what should be happening, how transitions should work, but also in our own schools, so working with people in our own schools to actually find out, to try these things, so hopefully to be able to come up with some sort of model that we can actually roll out to good practice for everyone to be involved in. So it's a wide-ranging set of services I look after, and my background was originally as an educator. I have 15 years in secondary education, mainstream secondary education, mostly in wonderful inner city schools, and I used to thoroughly love working with the bad lads. And as a result, yes, encountered a huge number of children with wide-ranging SEN. And it was actually because of, I don't know, how many of you here are teachers? Or, yeah? And yeah, your role is? Support, yeah, support workers. Absolutely. No, absolutely, we've all been there. So you'll all know what I mean when I say that when I was trained, I actually didn't learn much about any particular area of SEN, and especially not autism. So it was actually as a teacher and finding I was encountering more and more children in the mainstream setting with autism or Asperger's syndrome and not having a clue what to do, that I actually contacted the National Autistic Society and somehow got persuaded to become a volunteer, as the best way to find out how people with autism work is to actually work with them. So I became a volunteer, first as a befriender, then with our Education Rights Service, and the rest is history. My interest in this basically came about through a couple of situations in schools where, I'll give one very clear example, standing there, delivering a lesson, everything seemed to be going really well, and then a table came down the room towards me. And it was almost like an out-of-body experience, because the school's processes suddenly kicked in. The child was weeked away, there was obviously all discussion about what we should be doing with the child, exclusion was mentioned, and I was sort of thinking, all I want to know is why that happened. I had no other interest in finding out why that had happened and what I could potentially do in the future to stop it happening again. All I could see was that the child was very confused, rather distressed by what had happened, and all that was happening is we were talking about, oh, how long should we be putting the child out for? And that to me just seemed to be not quite, well, it wasn't what I wanted anyway. Whether it was the right thing or wrong thing, I'm not going to judge. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to know how to support that young man when he came back into my class, which he was inevitably going to do. So I suppose that's why I've been asked to be here today, is because of my experience in education, my knowledge and experience of working with people with autism. But as I was told this is a workshop, I'm not planning on telling you all the answers, because you can see from the wonderful title I've been given, Examining the Alternatives and Best Practice if there are none, I don't think anyone out there actually has all the answers. And I bet in this room there is actually plenty of experience which it is worth sharing. So what I would like to try to do here is actually have a bit more of a guided session where I can give some hopefully pearls of wisdom, but also learn some things from you guys. And what I'd like you to do first, and you're more or less sorted into 3 groups, if you could just have a few minutes quickly discussing what do we mean by exclusion, and second, and not jumping ahead in the slides would help. So I should always say at the beginning, please don't look at the slides up front. I do the same, I always do it. What do we mean by exclusion? And also the types of situation. Let's focus specifically on autism, but you can widen, I don't mind if you want to widen it, the sorts of situation that young people, children, are getting themselves into for which we are excluding them. Just have a few minutes discussion, we'll do a quick bit of feedback. What have you come up with in terms of what do we mean by exclusion? So we start with this table. What is exclusion? What do we mean by exclusion? No, what's the behaviour? What do we mean by exclusion?
Is it when the school makes a decision to say about to be there for a certain amount of time?
Okay, so a decision that the child is not to be in the school for a specific amount of time?
It's the removal of somebody from the situation. It doesn't have to be off-site. It can be internal.
Okay, so an internal exclusion, but still effectively separating them off from the normal school day. Yeah? Into that?
Separating off from the normal school day, isn't it? And kind of, as you were saying, that can happen for a very brief period, or it can happen for a longer period, or it can happen for several days. It can happen in school, they can send home. It's a whole range of things.
And that's what I wanted to get at with that point is when we're saying what do we mean by exclusion, there are actually a lot of ways in which children can be excluded. We've got the obvious ones. I've put the obvious ones, informal, which is obviously the ones that the Secretary of State says are illegal, but still happen. They're illegal, but it still happens where parents are called, say your child's not coping, they might be better off going home for the afternoon, whatever. These sorts of things, they do still happen. Just to be honest, but they just put them on the slide, they happen. The fixed term exclusion and the permanent exclusion, which sounds like the types that you're mostly talking about here, but you're right to actually say we need to actually look a bit more. Because when I was given the session title of Alternatives to, it got me thinking, so when does exclusion actually begin? And when I was starting to think, so again, for myself, what are the sort of behaviours, what sort of the situations that we're excluding children for? It again started me thinking, so what were all the antecedents to that behaviour, to that situation arising? And it just made me wonder, does actually exclusion start a lot sooner than we think? And again, it's just throwing it out to the open, it's something for people to think about, but there are situations that arise in our school where children are effectively excluded. They can be excluded from planned activities. The number of times a parent will contact us and say, the school's going on a trip, I've been told my child can't go. Yeah. And the issue there is, okay, it might be that that specific activity carried out in that specific way might be extremely challenging for that specific child. But in order to achieve the learning objective of that activity, do we need to do that specific activity? Is there something else we could be doing so that the child is included? And if we do go ahead and do that and not include the child, what is the impact, the cognitive, psychological, whatever impact on that child? How does it make that child feel about you as the educator? Yeah, I'm not saying there's going to be an easy answer to that, because we're all in very tricky situations sometimes. I'm thinking, well, I need to achieve a legitimate educational objective, and I can't find a simple way to do it that's going to include everybody. But if we do exclude in that way, it does have consequences, it does have effects on the child, it does have effects on our relationship with the family, which could be the start of things spiraling out of control. Yeah? The failure to make reasonable adjustments. Again, very, very tricky. What is reasonable? I I will, on a lot of my services, have people coming to us, not just for education, but for benefits, for all sorts of issues, saying, I'm being discriminated against. I have rights. I've said, I need this being done for me. That will help me do what I need to do. Therefore, it's reasonable. And you all understand autism. People with autism can be so rigid in their thinking that something they think is reasonable, they think must be reasonable for everybody. And I think the hardest part in my work when trying to explain the Equality Act is that reasonable means it has to be reasonable for both parties. Okay? It's actually, you can't ask for something that is completely unreasonable for the other party to provide. For example, lifts, if you need a wheelchair and the building doesn't have good accessibility. There are all these sorts of situations where specific adjustments can't be made because they're not reasonable for the person who's being asked to make them. But when we look at things like school policies, have we actually included all the disability type issues, the SEN type issues in our school policies? As you can see by looking at me, I've got piercings, the school policy on piercing. When I was a teacher, school policy on piercings, and that got me into big trouble all the time. The dress code. There may actually be a good reason why a person with autism may not be able to wear certain items of clothing, or at least certain fabrics. I think we've moved on a lot now. We're seeing so few cases now of schools specifying the exact fabric, and regardless of whether that caused somebody to have a terrible eczema incident. We've moved on from that, but it's just, again, we can, by actually looking at our policies and making people behave in certain ways, be excluding. Yeah, and again, it's that sort of impact, that effect it's going to have on people, on the person actually who's the recipient of that, or the person who's been affected by that policy. Lack of appropriate differentiation, and I'm not going to ask any to put up their hands, but I'd be more than happy to put my hand and say there were times when, in a rush to try to get a lesson plan written, I didn't think of everybody's needs in the classroom. It's a fact of life, I think, as a teacher, as an educator, as a support teacher, support worker. Actually, differentiating for every child is a massive challenge. And most of the time you get away with it. Most of the time you can get away with it, but sometimes it can come back to haunt you when you realise that your lesson has just been the worst experience imaginable for a particular child, because by not taking their needs into account, your lesson was totally inaccessible. You'd excluded them, effectively, from that lesson, even though they were sat there. You'd excluded them. So I've gone to the policy there. I think, again, in the adjustments is all this issue about giving clear instructions. I've given classrooms an instruction for an activity only to find that the majority of the class was sitting getting on with something else because they didn't really have a clue what my instructions meant. They're perfectly clear to me, and I did once spend quite a period of time trying to explain to the class what I meant, and then one kid suddenly went, "I think I've got it, sir. Can I tell the class?" And he went and told the class, and they went, "Oh, why didn't you just say so?" And it was just one of those weird situations where I didn't seem to be able to make myself clear, myself understood. And that, again, it just created that distance, that barrier between myself and my class, prevented them from getting on with the activity. And they were a very willing class. They would have got on with anything I told them to get on with. But by being unclear, I'd excluded them. And that's why I'm saying I think we need to think about this, about exclusion being much earlier. What are we doing in our schools throughout the day that actually excludes children and might lead on to more serious behaviours in the long run that could lead to more serious, the more fixed term, the permanent exclusions? Okay, the second part of that is the types of incident, the types of activity for which we're excluding. Shall we start at this table? What did you come up with, the sorts of things, the reasons we're excluding people?
Violent behaviour is what's the most common.
Okay, violent behaviour, yeah. And yeah, we all know how that can feel. It's very unpleasant to be actually on the receiving end of that, so absolutely. And anything else on this table? It's fine.
Sorry, you talked about it being an accumulation of small incidents that all eventually
All right, yeah.
broke the camel's back resulted
Yeah. So yeah, the accumulation of smaller incidents, so none of which on their own, but as a whole, they become very wearing, draining on the staff, draining on resources, and very difficult to manage, affecting other pupils, and so on.
Safety as well, so providing behaviour where safety of the pupils and
Yeah.
staff or the people themselves is a jeopardy. I think
Yeah.
certainly in our setting, the fixed term, we always define that term not by the magnitude of the behaviour, but by how long we think it will take us as a setting to put a plan in place to make their return safe. Sometimes that's a day,
Yeah.
sometimes, if it requires more teaching or more
Yeah.
training or something
Yeah.
like that, then absolutely not.
And I think we'll absolutely come back to that here when we look at the sort of the best practice type ideas, because that sounds great. That is exactly what we should be doing, and it's how we communicate that to the child, to the parent, so that they actually see that we're trying to make something positive come out of the exclusion, not it being a punishment and we're not going to change. Yeah? So you're punished, you either obey and come back, or you choose to carry on the way you are and we'll just permanently exclude you. Yeah, I think that's a really good start on what we need to come on to later. Yes?
I understand a lot about, in some of my clients' schools over the years, sexually inappropriate behaviours tend to be stamped on so very, very early
Yeah.
in that kind of progression, really, of
Yeah.
small incidents,
Yeah.
stereotyping,
Yeah.
and tend to kind of weighting
Yeah. Yeah.
but regardless of the age of the child, I've known some children of 6 and 7 who are sexually inappropriate behaviours, which
Yeah.
it seems they give a good understanding of the knowledge of the child.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Absolutely. And I was called in by a school quite recently to help advise them on a situation. In my head, I suppose a lot of the time, because the sort of teacher I was, I hated any child being excluded. If a school decided to try to exclude any of the children in my pastoral care, the answer was, no, you're not. You're giving me time to work on this. And I always had that attitude, there was nothing that we should, always trying to get into my head that we should not be excluding for any reason. But actually, this one incident recently just really challenged me on that one, is an incident of an older boy sexually assaulting a younger girl in the school. And I found myself really struggling with that one. It's like, what on earth do we do? Because we've got a duty of care to both pupils, actually. So, yeah, from going from a position of no, we don't exclude, there's absolutely no justification for ever excluding, really permanently that is, I've sort of found myself being challenged on that one. So again, we'll probably come back to that sort of situation a little bit later. Anything on this table?
Sometimes it's part of the process that you've gone through the steps and that's the last one.
Right. So you feel you're left with nothing other than to...
I've seen it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is what we do. If you do this one more time, this is what will happen. Oops, you did it one more time. Now you know what's going to happen. It'll get exploded.
Yeah. Always dangerous when you make a threat like that, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of in policy. It's enshrined in policy. That's our policy, and usually that's a result of disruption to the other children's learning.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anything else on this?
Sometimes it might be not necessarily the right way to do it, but a pathway to get children some provision, but if you're not in appropriate provision, the
Yes.
only way sometimes to get that is to go through all these steps that we're saying, and
Yeah.
actually that
Yeah.
the child is down at school.
And that will again come up in the best practice ideas, because the one thing I've noticed from my experience is that parents are terrified by exclusion, when actually sometimes it can be an opportunity. Especially if there is a long history of a school trying to say to their local authority, we are not coping with this child, we're not doing the best we could be doing for this child. We need additional support, or the child needs additional support, or the child really is better placed elsewhere. And the parents might actually feel that the child would be better placed elsewhere, but they're still terrified of the idea of exclusion. And it's a hearts and minds argument issue here of actually bringing the parents along with you, so they actually understand the process and what could come out of it, the possible benefits of it as well, if that's the situation.
Can I just ask a tiny bit there?
Yes.
To say that the kind of emphasis then falls on the deficit in the child rather than the deficit in the school and the provision. And it's very sad that in my sort of across the board,
Yeah.
that you see parents and children at the absolute breaking point before they get the provision
Yeah.
and support that they need.
Yes.
And it's very sad you've got to record of exclusion
Yes.
from that child's history, really.
Absolutely, I would totally agree with that. And I would be looking at this as, yes, this absolutely has to be the last resort, this permanent exclusion. But schools, teachers have to have the support they need to be able to support. So it's almost a way, rather than it being the fault of the child, it's not a fault of the teacher, it's not a fault of the child, it's a fault of the system for not making sure the support is actually there. That teachers actually have the training they need, that support staff have the training they need.
It isn't just about that though, because it needs something to be
Yeah.
so complex
Yeah.
that local authorities don't have provision for these extremely. We've got a child
Yeah.
with the mental the autism.
Yeah.
You try finding somebody that's experienced in that.
Yeah.
I'm an autism specialist teacher.
Yeah.
None of the strategies work for that.
No, absolutely.
And you know, he's not an ED place. He's not an ASD place. Where does he fit?
Yeah.
And you know, quite often it's you're fighting something. It's not that you're not trying to do what's right for the child. The
Yeah.
actual provision doesn't actually exist.
And that again is a problem with the system, that the provision doesn't exist. Is there something that we could make exist? Is it something that we could make exist? Is there a potential solution that could be created? And that's what we need to be doing, is challenging the system to say, we can't just say there is no solution. Our job is to come up with a solution.
But you're looking back, the reality of this is
Yeah.
within a bigger picture, you're talking about one child. You know, you can't provide it. You've got to look at it. It's really
But
difficult as a
legally,
practitioner,
but
isn't
legally
it?
the authority does have to provide what
Yeah.
that one child needs.
Yeah.
And see, because I think if you look at the system, I think parents and schools and most teachers go into teaching because they care about children and they want to do their best for them. And I think sometimes teachers, that's where schools do. A lot of schools bend over backwards for children to avoid them being excluded. But if you're in an authority where actually that's the way the child is going to access because the way I try to explain to people is the child has a right to have the provision that meets their needs. And it doesn't matter how good your intentions are, if your school isn't the right place for them, it's not about anybody failing or needing to feel guilty. It's about that child being entitled to have the right sort of provision that they need.
Yeah. And I think that's the key issue, is there obviously is an entitlement. We've got to come up with solutions. I mean, I'm all for the inclusive agenda, but I'm all against the inclusive agenda being misapplied. That inclusive education is not about sticking every child into a mainstream school and letting them sink or swim. It is about making the education accessible to all children, appropriate to all children and their individual needs. We've got to come up with the solutions. It's not a quick fix one, because obviously in a situation like that, you're dealing with a child who is being excluded, and because the solution doesn't yet exist, it will take time to create the solution. And it's then obviously coming up with a clear pathway about how we get to that solution, isn't it? I mean, I've seen some very interesting practices of online schooling. Some authorities actually saying, well, we can't provide anything within our schools, but as a form of home education, there are actually online schools, which in the long run actually worked out cost effective. Rather than sending a child to what might not be an appropriate, very expensive independent school, actually for some children whose main difficulties were actually just coping with other people being around them, who just wanted to better put their heads down and get on with something, this sort of schooling actually worked very well. It doesn't provide everything. It doesn't provide the access to social interaction. So it is not the ultimate solution, but it does at least get them the knowledge education side of things, the skills, that sort of thing.
Well, there's somewhere now you can do a degree online.
Yeah.
So you can do a degree online. And
Yeah.
we've had schools like mainstream schools that have actually managed exclusions better because through their portals, because the children can still access the work and have work set by, you know, rather than having to take photocopy sheets home or whatever, the work's there.
Yeah.
And it makes, and the authority that I work in is actually talking to some of the private providers who do these wonderful residential schools in the depths of nowhere about why they can't provide day schools. So that, you know, it makes it more accessible.
Yeah.
And children can then stay at home
Yeah.
and still go to school, like their peers, rather than having to go off and live, you know, miles away from their families and everything like that. So I think sometimes it's about that sort of taking that, and we've recently had, we used to have a you know, that old age-old thing where when a child's statement is excluded, the thing that is supposed to protect them becomes the biggest bit of red tape ever to find them a new school place.
Yeah.
And we now have a children out of school panel where while that red tape is being sorted out, we have interim provision put in. Even in fact, some would go into no matter what their disability and their level of autism, something is provided somewhere. So that it is possible to do things. It's having that willingness within the authority and the, you know, to put the money behind it and to be creative and look at new ways of approaching things, I think, rather than this is the way we do it and oh, that child isn't fit.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately our education system has gone very much the child has to fit the package rather than the package being assembled to fit the child. I never saw it. National curriculum is sort of, I think national curriculum should be there. I think national curriculum has excluded
Happy to have that, yeah.
all, you know, the child who just is never going to get their level 4, so they don't get the one-to-one from the TA anymore because they have to work with the child who might get the level 4, to the child who has, you know, challenging autism and other things and the school can't. I think that, you know, there's so much emphasis on outcomes, academic outcomes all the time, that excludes an awful lot of people and children from achieving their potential, because their potential just isn't ever going to be good enough.
Yeah. Okay.
So we write them off.
Yeah. I think you're right. The issue here is going to be the flexibility. Now, we all know we're going through a massive proposed change in the SEN system. I'm not convinced at the moment that the model they're putting together is going to provide all the answers, but I suppose we have to try to treat that as an opportunity. You know, we're in a position now to try to mould a new system. I'm a sceptical person, I suppose, in many ways. But I would like to see that as an opportunity to... I mean, we've got the whole idea of individual payments, so parents could obviously go and try to buy the support that their child needs. Will that work? Don't know.
It'll work for some people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not all, because not all parents... I work with children with disabilities who are in care. Not all children with disabilities have parents who are either willing or capable of fighting those battles for them, or meeting their child's needs themselves.
Yeah.
So they certainly wouldn't be able to use that money independently to get the best for their child.
And the children in care obviously is a very specific situation where you've got children who are being looked after by a local authority, being in a conflict of interest situation of having to challenge another team within the local authority. Yeah. So that's a specific challenge in its own right, but I totally accept that one. Did we have any other reasons for exclusion over here?
We've talked about those situations that just looked,
Yeah. Yeah. And can I ask, what type of education? You're in an education setting, yeah?
No.
You're not?
No,
Oh, you're the local authority, okay. Even harder for you as the local authority, because I was the situation, I was a secondary teacher, so the situation I described with the tail coming down the class, when we actually went backwards and tried to find out what the trigger was, we were dealing with a lot of little niggles throughout the day. And ultimately it had nothing to do with what had happened in my class, thank goodness, on this one occasion. No, nothing to do with what had gone on in my class. But it had exploded in my class. I meant to buy a Coke bottle coming here, so I don't know if any of you have seen that that little test. Actually, I could do it with one of these fizzy bottles, but... Okay, situation. Child arrives at school. It's normal for the child to go into a specific part of the playground and wait to be collected by the teacher, teacher assistant, whatever. That morning, they can't actually go to that part of the playground. It's been blocked off for some reason. They don't know where to go. Okay, first stressor of the day. Imagine me holding a Coke bottle. Shake, 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 shake. The teacher who would normally come and collect them isn't around, is off that day. No arrangement has been made, or nobody's actually told the person who will be looking after the child instead the arrangement to go and bring them in. And nobody's told the child in advance, so even if somebody did go towards them, they'll be feeling rather stressed. This is a stranger coming towards me and they're trying to make me walk away with them. Shake, 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 shake. Imagine what's happening now inside the Coke bottle. Yeah? You can imagine this throughout the day, building up, all these little stressors in a child's experience of a day. And we talk about these sudden explosions. Yeah, that happened in my situation. And a child has a couple of options. Actually, jumping ahead on the slides here. Good old psychological principle for anybody who's studied psychology. Fight or flight. With all this stress built up inside them, they've got no option but to pick one of these two options. Either to fight back or to run away. Now, both of those options are ones that children get excluded for. Yeah? If they fight back, I'll give another example. A child was excluded for violent, I really do mean violently, attacking another child in a classroom. And when they finally got the child with autism into a state where he was able to communicate what had been going on, it turned out that he'd been sat, it was in a primary school, he'd been sat there all day next to a child who was doing all day long. Now, we could go back and look over the various aspects of autism, but sensory issues is fast becoming much more recognised as a source of stress for people with autism. For this one child, that might as well have been somebody hammering nails into their head. So eventually, he had to make it stop. As far as he felt, he had to either make it stop, and he could have chosen to fight it, which is what he did, and brutally attacked the other child and got excluded in the process. Or he could have run away, but he'd already run away before in the past and had been restrained, pinned down to the ground. So he decided that this time not to do it, he would do something a bit more specific about it. I shouldn't laugh, but you can sort of see the sort of processes that are going on in this child's mind at this stage. What do I do? Now, many children are perfectly capable, with autism, perfectly capable of bottling things up and waiting until they get home and then exploding. So imagine they're at the Coke bottle. There is such a thing as a 3 o'clock syndrome with children with autism, where the first thing I've seen some children do is actually go out to the school gate and kick their mum. And mum's sort of used to this. And when I first saw it, I went and spoke to a particular mother. It was like, what's gone on? She said, oh, he does that. It's the stress of the school day. He just has to let it off somewhere. Some will wait till they go home and then wreck something. There's actually, I've noticed from personal experience as a teacher, but also from my work in the National Autistic Society, an unwillingness, a difficulty in some education professionals in acknowledging that children can bottle up this stress. So when parents try to say, oh, he feels all this stress at school, blows up when he gets home, so it must be a home problem, because he's absolutely fine whilst in school. So sometimes we won't actually see some of this happening until finally the child isn't able to bottle it up and just literally explodes in our classrooms. And that's when can often be our first real sign that this child isn't coping. Is it right to go down the line of exclusion on that one? Who knows? It obviously depends on the specific situation, but it should act as a warning that something isn't right. It may not have been right for quite a while. I mean, the flight one, there is a third alternative, which is more distressing. I encounter too many adolescents with autism who engage in some form of self-harm or suffer some other form of mental illness. Depression being quite common. And all of these things can end up making them withdraw from school completely, refusing to engage with anyone. So it's almost like a form of flight, but it's actually flying internally, sort of withdrawing completely into yourself and taking it all out on yourself. So this was basically just to show you that this is obviously, looking at children, this could be the only options they have. But we need to understand it, sort of saying, okay, so something's happened, what are we going to do about it? Did you come up with anything else? You sort of say there's some explosion. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah. Okay. I suppose the key thing to do is to start going through some of those and saying, so what are the options? If these are things that we are excluding children for, what could we be doing? I mean, I did come up with a list of things when it was just trying to stick with the actual title of the session. So reducing the causes of exclusion. But this could be added and could be extended indefinitely, probably. All the different types of things you could try within education settings. The ABC behaviour diary is actually quite an interesting one. You're talking about, first of all, A is the antecedent. What are the antecedents of B, the behaviour? And what are the consequences of that behaviour? Now, in a secondary school, it can be quite difficult to actually know what all the antecedents are. But a diary like this can actually help us to start spotting the triggers for poor behaviour, for the sorts of behaviour that are likely to get a child into trouble. And there may be many of these things that we can do something about. It could be just something to do with the classroom. If a child, so in primary school, if you're dealing with a child that gets moved around with the class quite a bit, that can be problematic. If the wall displays are constantly changing and they're all different colours and brightnesses all over the place, that could be challenging. It's not saying we don't do these things, but it's a case of saying, so how can we actually manage these things in a way that the child actually thinks they're fun and good? So rather than create a situation with the sensory environment in our classroom, yeah? So we might be able to say, for example, the child has just run out of the classroom. That's the behaviour. What happened before that? Well, they came into the classroom. Was there anything about the classroom that was new today? Oh yes, the display was changed overnight. At the end of the previous school day, child has come in and it's all suddenly changed. Was that possibly this trigger? Was that what was too much for the child? You know, maybe going to the room and think, this isn't my room. This literally is not my room. I'm running away in a bit of a state of confusion. So it's all about trying to find out the antecedents of behaviour. And that requires us to be brutally honest with ourselves. Did we, for any reason, snap at the child? And it happens. I mean, I know as a teacher I certainly snapped at children, sometimes completely unreasonably. Sometimes very reasonably as well, but sometimes totally unreasonably. And that had an effect on the child. I do know one day a child, when I snapped at them, just did run out. And it took quite a while to actually find them. They went off and hid, and that was very distressing as a teacher, hugely distressing. Thankfully, found them, they were safe. But it was just those sorts of things, the antecedents, the triggers for behaviours, being honest with ourselves and saying, are we doing something that could be triggering the sort of behaviour that we actually don't like? And that's where we go back to the policies and so on again, isn't it? doing the sensory audit, there can be things we can change. I remember one school I worked in where they suddenly got rid of that hideous bell at the end of lessons. There were actually no bells at the end of lessons. And school did fall into chaos with people forgetting to stop lessons or letting kids out early. We all managed to let the kids out on time and get the next class in on time, but it was actually so much more peaceful. What sort of places is the child having to go into? I mean, unstructured times can be the worst of all because they're going, for example, into large halls, dining halls, so on, where the echo, the clatter of cutlery, the clatter of plates, the noise, the smells. In terms of a sensory overload, dining halls is probably amongst the worst places you can imagine. Does a child with autism actually behave badly during the lunch break? Are they stood there trying so hard to actually keep themselves under control that when somebody brushes against them, they think they've been violently hit? Because whilst trying to control everything else, that being brushed against might come across as being more severe than it actually is in the child's mind. Is there anything we can do about that? So it really is all about, the sensory audit is all about saying, so where are the sensory challenges in our school and what can we do about it? It may not be that, maybe that we can't actually change the school environment, but we might be able to change the way in which the child is able to engage with it. I've never personally liked children being taken out and given lunch in separate areas from everyone else. That always felt very, very difficult for me. But there may be ways around that for the child. Some places try a child with a small group of friends together, so the child is still actually engaging some form of social interaction during that time. Playgrounds, sorts of games that children play. You either have to be in on the rules or you're completely out of it, and especially when they're running all over the place, unless you're actually able to spot what's going on and therefore where people are likely to run to, you're going to find yourself in the way all the time. You know, it's these sorts of things. What can we do about it? If we see behaviour started to deteriorate straight after lunch, well, we've got a pretty good idea of what sort of things have been going on. What does the child need in that situation? Do they need to be coming from a really stressful environment into a classroom with no time to calm down and suddenly have demands put on them to carry out a specific activity? Is there something that can be done? I know, actually, the final slide of things is one school actually does allow sort of sensory breaks. And I think, again, it will depend on each individual school about what's appropriate, or each individual child, what's appropriate. But there might be ways of actually bringing the excitement down. I mean, forget about children with autism. Straight after lunch can be an absolute nightmare for any teacher anyway. When the kids come in completely hyper, they've had all this sweet, all this sugar, all these crisps and what have you. They've been running around. It's having that, coming up with those sorts of strategies, isn't it? The sources of stress in a lesson as part of the planning process. And that was something I actually found. So if I were being taught this lesson, where would it be difficult for me? I mean, as a teacher, I was always encouraged, all the schools I worked in actually really encouraged us to go and observe one another's lessons, and it gave a real chance to see what was going on around the school. I did one day follow one child and found out that all day they went into science and were taught about volcanoes and the geology aspect of volcanoes to start the day. They then went to an English lesson and they had to write a poem about volcanoes. They went to RE, and somewhere in that RE lesson was about tribes that actually saw volcanoes as gods, spiritual beings, and carried out sacrifices to volcanoes. It seemed to be that for some strange reason this whole school had gone volcano mad. And this did almost happen. It's obviously completely by chance. But again, for those children, it was like, oh my God, we're going to another lesson, and all this teacher is doing is talking about volcanoes. We've had enough of volcanoes already. Yeah? I mean, I know you can't, you've been in a very busy secondary school, say, can we actually try a bit of coordination of our curriculums to make sure we're not all covering the same sort of areas? Just as sometimes it's actually worth talking together and actually making sure you do a united topic, which you could then advertise to the children and say, look, today we are actually having a special topic on this, so whatever you go to, you'll be talking about that. No, but it actually involves them in it then, rather than they just think we've all gone mad. So the sources of stress in a lesson, unclear instructions. Time pressure for children with autism. Timings can be an absolute nightmare. Yeah. I'm sure you can all come up with other parts of things in a lesson that would actually be stressful to a child. Change of teacher, all these sorts of standard things can be stressful. Understand that the child may not be able to understand why their behaviour is wrong or explain themselves immediately. And that could be one where also you do want the child to be withdrawn from the environment, not as in itself as a punishment, but just as an opportunity for them to be able to calm themselves down, get themselves back into a sane place. And that might mean, rather than the punishment, and I think specifically one school I was in, was you got sent to a specific room, which is basically where all the bad kids were. Yeah? It never was a situation that a child would say, okay, this child actually needs to go with a support assistant or to go and speak to the Senko, but actually in a room, low sensory, low stimulation room, and nobody's going to suddenly start launching questions at them. They're going to be given the time to come out themselves. Okay, because in itself, just by launching in with the questions, that's adding to the stress. A lot of schools are actually doing quite nice programs of child or independent advocates. Children actually supporting one another can be very powerful. Again, it has to be very carefully managed. And obviously the child being supporting has to be appropriate for the child needing the support. But that actually can work really well and can help to reduce some of the social isolation that children with autism can experience. Actually, for children who find it difficult to find friends, this actually could be the start of a good friendship. Okay? So if the fact that they're socially isolated, feel they don't have any friends, feel that everyone's against them, is one of the stresses they experience whilst being in school, that can help. Listening to parents. I'm talking to a already converted crowd here. Parents, in terms of the child's autism and what works and doesn't work and what triggers the child, are often the best people to talk to. They know. And they may not be able to always express it clearly. They just know that if you do this, that happens. And you might need to do some extra work using your specialists that you've got access to, your educational psychologist, speech and language therapist, whoever you've got access to, autism outreach teams, if they still exist. I know they don't exist in all areas now, but hopefully you do have access to autism outreach teams. To actually do a bit more digging into the actual specifics of that trigger. But it's all about, I'm sure you can see, making the school environment more friendly for the particular child. Discuss with other professionals. The NAS has a professional online network called Network Autism. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. But if you just Google NAS Network Autism, you'll find there. You can join up and you can join various groups. We do actually have an exclusions group on Network Autism. Now, how does this help? When I was a teacher, I often found that by just discussing things with the other professionals in my own schools, we were all experiencing the same difficulties. It made us all made it difficult for us together to come up with solutions because we were all drained by the same situation. But here, you can be talking to professionals, posting to professionals across the UK. You don't even have to say who you are or where you are. You can be completely anonymous. And we have a whole range of professional groups on Network Autism. I just think the exclusions or even the teaching ones could be quite useful places to start exploring options and sharing good practice. So there's loads of it going on. The obvious one is staff training and autism awareness. But please, don't let this just be the standard. Oh, there's a triad of impairments and there's some sensory issues as well. Don't let it be a bog standard model. Make sure it is actually tailored to the children that the professionals are going to be working with. Yeah? Try to make it, because we've got the triad, but every child with autism is different. They will all have different levels of social communication difficulty. They all have different levels of sensory and different types of sensory difficulty. A whole range of other things. Have any of you come across sensory integration disorder? Yeah. Who hasn't? Okay. It can be quite difficult to explain it in full, but I can give you a couple of clear examples. If you were to close your eyes and put your hands out here and bring your fingers together, how successful would you be? Yeah. But you'd be pretty good. All of you would be pretty good because you have, your brain is working in an integrated way with your limbs, with your senses, to actually say, well, actually, I can feel that's coming, so I need to move that one up a bit or that one down a bit, and they will actually, in and out, and they will meet. Some children with autism find controlling their body very difficult. Okay, and that's because the information is not being properly managed by their brains on a very simple level, really reducing this to almost absurdity. But so, another possible stressor. Or 2 volunteers. Who's going to volunteer? Got one volunteer. Who else is going to volunteer? Yeah, come on then. Okay, I've got a piece of flip chart here. Come and grab a... Actually, let's take 2 pieces of flip chart. Okay, I'm going to pop them on this table here, and I want you to do the same activity, but you're going to do it slightly differently. I want both of you to write out the letters of the alphabet. Okay, as in order, A, B, C, D. So I'll try to be autism friendly. I don't mean write the phrase, the letters of the alphabet. I mean to write out the alphabet in order from A through to Z. But I want you to do it writing as you normally would. So hold the pen as you normally would. You, I want you to hold it in a fist and squeeze that pen as hard as you can. Okay? We'll see who gets there first. 3, 2, 1, go. Really hard. Really squeeze it hard. Okay, you can stop. Okay, it's a simple way of trying to prove a very simple point. Many children with... Okay, you can sit down now, please. Many children with sensory integration disorder will not get a message coming from their fingers to their brain saying you're holding the pen firmly enough. They will squeeze that pen until the message, because the little pads in between their joints, will eventually send the message to the brain that says you're holding your pen firmly enough. This isn't just for children with autism, this could apply to a huge number of children. What's going to be the effect of having to squeeze that pen so hard all the time? Tiredness, achy, slow, all of this, and the child will become stressed, fed up, oh, this work is hard, I can't do it. They don't know why they can't do it, they just, oh, my hand's aching, yeah, and they give up. They absolutely give up. It's all about autism awareness, but let's actually make sure we know this specific child. What does this child actually find hard to do? Not that they have social communication difficulties, what can't they do? But also actually what can they do, because what they can do is often the way into the things that they can't do, you know. Boost their confidence by doing lots of the things they're good at, by bringing in those little challenges. find out, you can soon, pretty soon spot a child who's actually finding writing things difficult. Their handwriting becomes appalling as well, because if they're often resting on the table with one arm, they're not holding the page properly, they're writing, so the page is actually, well, the book is moving around the table as well. It can become quite a mess. So that's what I'm saying about autism, is actually find out more about their autism. One thing I've always found with statements in particular, I mean, one of my assumptions here is all the children we've been working with do have statements, but I know a lot of them don't. Statements in law have to be clear and precise, but they rarely are. They rarely are. They rarely state exactly a full list of what the child can and cannot do. I mean, I find it really fascinating, really helpful when we get a child. Many parents are doing this independently, unfortunately, but they're getting, finally, a full cognitive profile of the child. And that's a real insight, because it tells you exactly what the child finds difficult to do in the old grey matter, what the areas that the grey matter isn't working. If you're just observing behaviour, you can't really say why it's not working. But actually, these cognitive tests, as part of a battery of assessments, can be really helpful and can actually help you identify some things. A number of times I've seen these done on children who I've been teaching and struggling with, and suddenly look at the profile and go, that explains it. And I've been able to adjust my behaviour. But up until then, my behaviour has been a challenge for the child. Yeah? So it's really all about making sure you know their autism, how it affects them as an individual, and making your adjustments according. So, is it going to get rid of exclusion? Of course not. There still will be some children who need to be excluded from time to time. But I'm coming from this in terms of the way of saying, well, let's actually look at our environment, our school environment, and what we can do to actually reduce the chances of it ever getting there. Yeah? And something I know you all do all the time, but I hope by looking at some of these sort of lists and just the few examples we've covered today, you will actually be saying, yeah, I can actually think myself of some things I might be able to try doing. Yeah? Right. We need to move on to the next bit, alternatives. It's tough, isn't it? What are the alternatives to exclusion if it becomes obvious that it has to be done, that we have to exclude? Before we actually go through that, would you again in your groups, I'd really appreciate some feedback from you. Talk about the sorts of things you've done as alternatives to exclusion. Yeah? Before we move on to this, what sort of things have you done as alternatives? So, and things that you found have worked, so we can start sharing some of those out just for a few minutes. Okay, let's start with the middle group first. Do you want to talk about some of the experiences you've had then? So some really good examples of... All right, loads of examples of good practice then. I was thinking about your strategies for the de-escalation side of things.
Extremely threatening environment. So the big fear factor is to involve working with him, and he become excluded from a setting. I'd had him in my unit for a couple of years, fully integrated into the mainland school, but he was permanently at risk of being excluded because of his violent outbursts. So we had to look at how we could sustain him in our setting in order for him to access the appropriate post 16.
Yeah.
He wouldn't get that appropriate provision. But of course I was desperate, if you like, to continue making sure that he finished with a sort of positive note. But because he was so reliant on me and my team personally for managing his behaviour, and at the time I was only working 4 days a week, we had to take all the strategies that we felt were successful and train him to use them independently. So we used a lot of time out So eventually he was able to manage his own anxiety and he was out of lessons for 5-minute periods of time and then return to task, which was a very valuable skill actually, that, because he was identifying as a problem, taking himself, removing himself, managing it, then returning, which obviously became a very useful skill he could then take on.
And I think that's just a brilliant example of good practice, is using it as an opportunity to skill up the individual, rather than saying, this is not acceptable, we're going to keep punishing you until you learn to stop doing it.
I'm a primary practitioner, but I've followed him all the way to secondary, so I've had to learn skills I've used in the primary sector to actually adapt and change to in the secondary. A lot of the work I'm doing now is looking at those 16. I think that's one of the big things we do as educators, is just stop and listen. We have to go the whole way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I really did like that idea of actually giving this young man ownership of his own behaviour and control over his own behaviour, so the strategies. And I think that's key to a lot of things with young people, with children generally, but specifically with young people with autism, is actually helping them to develop those strategies and practice them. I mean, yes, okay, egg timers can initially in themselves be stressful because, oh my God, I've got to calm myself down before that sand runs through.
There was a lot of work that went into
And
that.
again, yeah, precisely.
You know, I mean, that's a very simplistic version.
Absolutely,
You're
absolutely.
looking at years of work,
Yeah.
and then at year 7, and then at year 11.
Yeah.
You know, so you're looking at
Yeah.
a very long
Yeah.
period of time.
But I mean, it is an excellent way of part of the ongoing strategy of just introducing something like that, so they do know. And it applies to a lot of things. I mean, mental health depression is quite a classic one. Depression in children could be young people could be very debilitating. It can still be in adulthood, but actually, as an adult with any illness, I mean, how many of you would have, as a child, have fallen foul of colds and be completely unable to do anything? Whereas now you just sort of work through them. You sort of get used to it. You develop your strategies, don't you? And that's using illness as an example. Mental health is the same. Depression. I know I suffer depression myself, and I know now I can feel it myself when I'm starting to go on a downward spiral, and I put my strategies in place. It's just what you do. It doesn't mean it works all the time. And obviously, any of these strategies you teach young people with autism won't work all the time. But actually, if somebody has tried to use their strategy and it's not worked, should you be punishing them, or should you be praising them for at least trying the strategy? It's sort of almost like trying to turn these things around, isn't it? And say, instead of focusing on the punishment and the discipline side of things, because in many cases all it does is breed resentment, rather than actually create or build good behaviour. It's actually, I think that was just a lovely example, I really do, the long-term working. Over here, the examples. It's really about anything people have done to try to de-escalate things, reduce stress, avoid exclusion type situations.
We talked about a variety of different things, moving people to a different class, putting in a part-time timetable with planned or phased reintegration, providing a shared placement and maybe doing the same thing, transition phase, looking at alternative provision, calling in expert advice like CAMS team or the team around the child and education psychologists.
Yeah, so getting the tips and ideas. Can I just say, I like this idea, the focus you've put there on transition, phased in. It's actually making sure these are structured. What that's shouting to me is structure, which is, as we'll all know, exactly what people with autism like. Whether they're children, whether they're adults, they like structure that they can rely on. It is obviously making sure that is reliable. I dealt recently with a parent who has employed a counsellor or some sort of counselling service for her 22-year-old son. But he's now become dependent on it. There never was a withdrawal plan in place, and now she's stuck paying for very expensive counselling that the other can't get out of. it's almost like there wasn't that structure, there wasn't that planning done in the first place. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How long is it going to go on for? And how are we going to withdraw? How are we going to terminate this? Because you might find you create a plan, a structure in the first place, and a young person with autism might resist it, might be against it, but actually you'll find them in no time at all relying on it. And actually going, oh, looking at their pictorial timetable, for example, go, oh, I need to be doing that now, and they go and get on with it.
I think that one perhaps strategy from that is to try and build in, rather than having a meeting where you agree something and that's that, always plan a review meeting.
Yeah.
If you don't feel you need it later on, you don't have, you can always cancel it.
Yeah.
But always plan the next meeting
Yeah.
so that you can all get together and look at what's working, what isn't working, where are the next steps, where do we want
Yeah.
to go. So, because I think multi-agency working is the key
Yeah.
a lot of the time, including parents and carers, and keeping, once you've got people around the table, keeping that link going is what really makes a difference.
And on this table, you also mentioned the parental involvement, that actually sometimes parents are left out of the equation, which is always very sad when that's the situation. All these things will work better if everybody is, as you say, working as a team. That's not just the professionals. The parents must be, and the young person themselves must be a part of that team. I think one of the most odd things I've seen in exclusions is that this idea of you've got to come back. You won't be allowed to come back until you've signed a behaviour contract. But actually, the terms of the behaviour contract are usually imposed ones that are not explained to the child. And it is effectively just a...
And what does a contract doesn't mean anything to
Yeah.
We've actually been asked to sign a behaviour contract for our 6-year-old son who's got autism and ADHD who can't read or write, and it's a child signature, and it was for the bus of his behaviour on the transport to school, but we kind of said, well, it stands with autism, so it's like against sort of DDA, and like it's just too rigid. There are all things that happen because of his disability, and different things happen on different days for different reasons.
It is about saying, so if there's this challenge, if there's this specific challenge on the school transport, how are we going to address that rather than, you won't do it again, will you? Yes. It's quite a simple one, but that's a good example of it, though, where these contracts are just produced. You're expected to sign. Yeah, yeah. Of this group, you're having some very interesting conversations going on over here.
I've been thinking that in our work across a number of schools. The schools, I think, have been very effective at addressing quite complex needs relating to exclusion. Those where you've got a very clear understanding and assessment of the child's needs, where you've got the input of the young person into their plan,
Yes.
into their support plan.
Yeah.
Where you have a menu of strategies that are, it might be about moving to another class, it might be about a part-time timetable, it might be appointing different staff to work with them. Whatever the strategies are, it's a menu of strategies.
Yeah.
And where the school and the staff has the confidence to be flexible in applying those strategies, not rigidly saying, this is what we do, this is the child's got to fix.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of policies can be to, implement too rigidly.
And actually that goes into the legislation as well. And I understand why parents always want statements, for example, to be specific and specified and quantified to the nth degree. I totally understand why, because they're afraid that without that they won't get the support. But again, I think schools need to work with those parents and say, look, we know it says that, but having worked with your child, we'd like to try something. And again, it's buy-in, isn't it? Getting parents to buy into this and say, to see that what you're trying to do is actually possibly, or hopefully, in the best interest of the child. It's definitely in the best interest of the child. You're not guaranteeing that it will work. You're not saying it's a complete alternative what's in the statement. But actually, let's try something. And I think parents will respond really well to that. Rather than we're not doing what's in the statement, we're doing something else, which will immediately get their backs up.
I mean, you kind of hope that it would into a statement, because the statement should be more comprehensive than
Yeah.
any strategy that you have defined at any one time. But it is having that flexibility. The statement is always fairly static. So
Yeah.
you want always to be progressive in your
Yes.
actions.
Yes, absolutely.
Including what's going on
Yeah.
locally and nationally, what's
Yeah.
going on internationally. What are new ideas.
Yeah.
But the statement will always reflect
Yeah, yeah. And that can be a challenge again with statements, because there's still a number of statements you'll see which were originally written when the child was 5, and the child can move to 14. They've gone to secondary school, all that's changed the name of the school in part 4. The statement doesn't reflect that they're now in adolescence. So these issues we're dealing with the sexualized behaviour, well, maybe something needs to be in there to actually say this child needs specific support to actually understand relationships, to understand what is acceptable and what's not acceptable and why. Because sex is still something we're not particularly happy talking about, apart from in a very scientific way.
But equally, you can have behaviours of the child still in the same fashion, not behaviours of the child now.
Yes.
That's the end of it. That's the local authority. I mean, the local authority has to go and then review it. Instead, it should be just authority. I accept that you do see them in the way it's described.
Yeah.
That's a failure of what
Yeah. And I will say, in the services I run, we only ever see the worst examples. Well, nobody's going to come to us and say, we've got some brilliant examples going on here. So, yeah.
There's always a space at the end of the annual review form that says what changes should be made to the statement. And then any annual group on any local authority, however.
Yeah, they can do it now.
Mm.
That's
No.
yes, it's true.
Yeah.
It's a contradiction with the terminology annual review.
Yeah.
You are there to review the document.
I would say on that one, parents do have a right of appeal. If they've got a statement, they do have a right of appeal every year if they want to. So actually, if things should be changed, including having things removed, because, for example, if it says a child still cannot do up their shoes and buttons and whatever, but they now can, is it really appropriate that somebody should be trying to get them dressed when they can do it perfectly well for themselves? Okay, not a great example, but you get the point from it. Yeah. 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 No, I understand. There are plenty of organisations out there, including our own Education Rights Service, that will help parents do that. And that obviously then is, as if you're within the schools, that's your role taken away from it, because presumably, obviously you'll have been involved in the annual review, you will have made your recommendations to the local authority, which would be that certain parts of the statement should be changed. If they've chosen not to do it, then it's with the local authority. And local authorities don't want to be going through tribunals. I think if there's simple changes they can make, they would rather settle those cases very quickly. And at least it just keeps the statement regular.
The parents saying that they're going to do that and maybe filling in the form, that sharps up the attention of the local authority.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not encouraged, I don't want to put local authorities under so much pressure with so many tribunals. It's the last thing I want. But
So it gets withdrawn.
it just, yes, it just means, well, if it just helps to sharpen up the practice and make sure that changes that should be made, that obviously should be made, do get made, then great. I did like another example from here where we were talking about this fight and flight idea, the children who are runners. They all exist, and restraint can be the worst thing you can do. Actually, I've seen one that went through for a disability discrimination tribunal, where the child was being grabbed hold of, was trying to run, had been grabbed hold of outside the classroom by a couple of professionals. I'm not sure what that was. Okay. So the child was grabbed outside the classroom, and because he was kicking out, they tried taking off his shoes, and he shouted back at them, "Don't take my shoes off, I want to kick you." So it went to a tribunal, and the local authority were arguing, well, this child has a tendency to violent behaviour, abusive behaviour. Now, in the Equality Act, whilst autism is a protected characteristic, a tendency to violent behaviour, not necessarily within autism, within any situation, is not protected and does not come under the remit of the Education Tribunal when you're dealing with children, or the local courts when you're dealing with adults. But tribunals are saying, okay, so maybe we can't actually look at the exclusion because the reason for the exclusion is this apparent tendency, but tribunals, one parent is actually going through the upper tribunal at the moment to have this, the definition of tendency firmed up. What actually is a tendency and what actually is abusive behaviour, to try to have those firmed up. Most parents just don't want to fight it anymore, they just give up. But actually I think that would be quite helpful, both for schools, local authorities and for parents, to actually, for anybody to have those terms firmed up a bit better. But tribunals are saying, well, okay, maybe we can't look at that, but there's actually still nothing stopping us looking at whether the actions taken by the schools beforehand were in any way disadvantageous and therefore constituted discrimination against the child.
And now the law has recently changed, and any parent who has had a child excluded and they feel that their child's special needs have contributed to that exclusion,
Yeah.
they can take a special needs expert into
Yes.
meetings with them.
But I see parents also, if one of the aims of the parent is to actually get their child reinstated, there's no point going through this new independent review panel because the reinstatement option was removed. So more and more parents, from what I'm seeing, are going down the discrimination alternative through the tribunal.
Yeah.
And SEN panels, actually the first tier tribunal, Special Education Needs and Disability, is actually starting to look at whether there should always be an autism expert on the panel. So, yeah. But you're right, if all they want to do is get the exclusion overturned regardless, they don't want to go back to the school, they just don't want it on the child's record, there should be an SEN expert on the review panel. Yeah. But you came up with this idea with the runaway children, that they actually, it was more about actually having a safe option for them. So you're not having to try to grab them. Because I did have a situation where a child ran and we had spent ages trying to find them. It's horrible, it's absolutely horrible. But instead of doing that, they've actually got a safe option to go to. It doesn't necessarily mean the person they want to talk to is necessarily in that room all the time. But there must be some way, some system of the child going to a place and an alert coming up that this is where the child will be. Yeah, so it's also just, again, it's our systems, isn't it? So we're not excluding children where we could come up with alternatives. Just to finish then, sorry. We've already said all of these. We're looking at the deeper investigation causes of the behaviours that could lead to exclusion. Right? So it's what's actually causing the exclusion, let's actually investigate deeper. Let's go for the statutory assessment. Actually, statutory assessment should be carried out if a child is being moved to a PRU. So let's actually not be afraid of the statutory assessment process. It finds out a lot of information for us if a child doesn't have a statement. If they do have one, then we could go down a full reassessment line, but are there other ways of actually not having to do that by just getting the right professionals in to review all the circumstances? Clear statement, alternative education arrangements whilst this is happening. I think one of the things that parents come to us a lot saying is, my child's been excluded, but they're not being provided with any education at the moment. It's tough, so that will always be a rod to beat schools and local authorities with. So let's actually see what, and again, work with the parents to make it actually suitable. I put reasonable adjustments to best endeavours. They're legal terms. I'm not going to go into those now. But best endeavours doesn't mean you just had a go. Best endeavours means you had a really, really good go, and there was absolutely, literally nothing you could do. So everyone is expected to make their best endeavours. That doesn't mean we just have a good go at it, good crack at it. We really go that extra mile in terms of the law. I've already mentioned there's slightly disability discrimination. Managed transfers to another school. Managed transfers can work really well. And again, it's engaging the parent, helping the parent be part of that process. Transition planning, ouch. Including time frames that suit the child. If you're going to do a managed transfer or if you're going to bring them back in, let's actually make sure that the process we're putting in place is actually right for the child. I've put home education as an interim measure, but only if parents agree and can deliver. I know some parents have been told they've got no option, you're going to have to home educate your child because we're not going to provide them with anything. Again, I only ever see the worst examples, the worst practice. You can't do that. Most parents, well, simply, full stop, parents are not generally educators. So you can't put that pressure on them. But if they do choose to home educate, local authorities still have a duty to provide the support and to monitor the education that's being provided. So, but what I will say all along is basically bring the parents along with you. Always involve the child, always involve the parents, and hopefully you'll be able to get to the bottom of these things before they become excludable behaviours. Okay, well, thank you for that. I found it interesting. Great listening to your examples. I hope just getting you thinking of some of these things has started loads of ideas jumping around in your head that you're going to have a go. But do go on to Network Autism in our site. It is free at the moment, I suppose. I don't know if there's ever any plans to try to make it a chargeable thing in the future, but it is free. Get on there and start checking these. Even sharing good examples. People don't often go on often enough and share good examples of things they've tried that really worked. So please do that, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.